Good afternoon, everybody. Happy International Women in Engineering Day. My name is Colette O'Shea. I'm the Vice Chair of the Women in Engineering Group for Engineers Ireland. I'm also a Chartered Engineer, a Fellow of Engineers Ireland, and I'm currently working as a Senior Project Manager with the National Development Finance Agency. I'm delighted to welcome you here today to the second event for the Women in Engineering Group and our first to mark International Women in Engineering Day. The Women in Engineering Group was founded in January of this year after a few years gestation as part of the Diversity and Inclusion Group in Engineers Ireland. We're a committee of 12 female engineers who want to bring about change in the industry to offer more support to female engineers and also to change the industry to someday achieve a world where gender is a non-issue. But we can't do this together, or we can't do this alone. We need the support of our male colleagues. So I want to ask those male audience members who are with us today to participate in the Q&A session at the end of this event and in our other events, and also to speak in the wider industry to help us keep the momentum of change that's growing within the industry to address gender issues. For anybody who would like to get in touch with the Women in Engineering Group, we have a LinkedIn page and you'll find us if you search Engineers Ireland Women in Engineering Group. And we would love to get more people involved in the group and to have as diverse a voice as possible, because what we're asking is a lot of change and to change some of the fundamentals in the industry, and the more inclusive and the more kind of group thinking that we have, the better that we can achieve this. So today's discussion, we hope on rethinking the culture of work, will hope to inform and spark discussion across the industry, especially now that we're in a space where organizations and individuals are thinking about what the world of work looks like coming out of the last 16 to 18 months of the COVID pandemic. We have a very exciting panel, but before I introduce them, we're very honoured today to have Orla, the President of Engineers Ireland, with us. Orla will be joining our panel discussion, but before we get to that, I might ask Orla to say a few words to open our event. Orla.
Very much, Colette, and thanks very much for the invitation to be here. This is a cause very close to my own heart. So first of all, happy International Women in Engineering Day to everybody. Thanks to you, Colette, and to the Women in Engineering Group for taking the leadership in this really important area for benefiting our profession in this vital way. We all know that we need to draw on the talents of all of our population in order to deliver the sustainable solutions that society needs. And we know that women have to be front and centre in that. So thanks again, Colette and the group. I think that today's topic is a really timely one for so many of us. The whole question of rethinking work culture. We're coming out of a transformation to work culture none of us would have expected 2 years ago, but we've all lived through, and we've lived through it at lightning pace. And the question now is, as we look, we hope, to a reversion back to something closer to normality, what elements of what we've lived through will we take forward, and what elements do we not want to take forward? So I think to think critically about this extraordinary time, and then to think about how we move forward. And of course, we're moving forward. You know, the world is not just about COVID and the consequences of COVID. The sustainability agenda, of course, is huge. The digital transformation possibilities are enormous. They were there before the pandemic. They're still here after the pandemic. And some of the changes in work practices are very relevant to both of those. So I look forward to a really great discussion over the next hour. And I'll hand back to you, Colette.
Thanks, Orla. And on behalf of the Women in Engineering Group, we hope we can live up to the aspirations that you have for yourselves. So just to introduce today's event will be a panel discussion followed by a Q&A session. So if they're going to ask you to put any questions that you have during the event in the Q&A box rather than the chat box, it just makes our life a little bit easier at this end to collate them and put them to the panel. And we will put as many of them as we can to the panel towards the end of the event. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speakers for today. So our first speaker is Margaret Mcgrath. Margaret is Global Strategic Positions Lead at Dell Technologies, She's widely recognised as an industry thinker on the future of work, digital and security transformations, diversity and inclusion, and positive mental health. And in 2021, Margarete was named by SC Media at the Women of Influence Award as one of the top 30 cybersecurity leaders. Our second speaker is Fergus Sharkey. Fergus is a senior manager with Sustainability Energy Authority of Ireland. He has responsibility for business and public sector programs. Fergus is a chartered electrical engineer and a PhD, and he has experience in managing and motivating people both in the private and the public sector roles. Orla is the president of Engineers Ireland. She's the vice president for research, innovation and impact in UCD, as well as being a professor of electronic engineering. She's a fellow of Engineers Ireland, the Irish Academy of Engineering, and the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineering, amongst many others. We will also be joined today by Sarah Flanagan from the Women in Engineering Group. Sarah is a chartered engineer. She is a senior project manager with Atkins, and she's the brains and the creative thinker behind our Women in Engineering video that we released yesterday to commemorate International Women in Engineering Day, which you'll find on our LinkedIn page. Sarah will be taking note of all the audience questions that come in and will be joining us later in the event to put them to the panel. Now that the introductions are over, I'll ask Margarete to speak for a few moments about what she's experiencing in the global market in relation to working culture and trends in a post-COVID era. Margarete?
Thanks so much for that introduction, Claire, and wonderful to be on this panel discussion with such esteemed speakers, first of all, so thank you for inviting me. Look, I can give some perspectives from where we're seeing it from the technology side. So I work for Dell Technologies, and we have a large footprint around the world, but we have a large engineering base, a large research and development base, and then we have a large sales force. And so a lot of, as Orla touched on, I guess the pace and change of digitalization has far accelerated anybody else's expectations. Like nobody saw this pandemic coming. And so we've been involved in supporting a lot of our large and small customers with their digital shifts and digital changes over the last 18 months. And I guess as an organization ourselves with a large workforce, we've had to pivot, right? Because we've always had people working in our large centers, whether it's in our manufacturing lines or in our factories, or in our sales teams out and about. So we've had to really pivot the organization quite quickly. Now, Dell Technologies has always been a remote first organization. So in many ways, we have the technology as a tech company, you'd hope that we would. And we certainly pivoted overnight to making that shift. So internally, it wasn't as difficult as what we saw for some of our customer base that made that shift. Where we helped them transition moving contact centers from being in large cities to remote locations, moving trading functions overnight as well into online locations. So major shifts around digital. I think what we've seen both internally and with our client base is right now things are beginning to settle a little bit. I think we're all getting used to the language around hybrid working and remote working. And I think for many organizations, 2 years ago, this would have been like certainly not considered. If I think about the legal profession, they absolutely weren't ready in many ways for this kind of transition that we've made. But now I think that they're all kind of considering what's the long-term plan? Like, how are we really going to address this? What is hybrid working going to look like? And what does good look like for our new talent coming through and for our workforce to make sure that they're effective, they're productive, and they're happy as well, more than anything else. One of the things that we've certainly found with our workforce is there's a real pressure from a mental health perspective. So actually the drain, because you're constantly on Zoom calls or team calls, and as productive as it may be, not having a daily commute, it is a bit of a hamster wheel all the time. So actually we're now kind of coming to terms with how do we focus more on well-being? How do we focus more on health and safety? And where is the duty of care for employers? Is it beyond the office and actually at home as well? So we're having really engaging and interesting conversations internally on that. And I know we're definitely having those conversations with some of our client base as well. Certainly from a UK perspective where I'm based at the moment, we're seeing some big announcements coming through in the marketplace. So Morgan Stanley announced last week that they want their staff to go back into the office fairly soon. There's others like Goldman Sachs who've also come out recently. And then we've seen a contrast of that with some of the big four. So Deloitte Consulting coming in and saying, actually, you know, we've decided you can work anywhere. So we're really of the view that actually can work anywhere from a technology perspective. And I think it's working well so far. We've done a lot of surveys. I'm sure everybody on this call has been surveyed to death. We've kind of reviewed the surveys as the transition and the pandemic progressed. But now we're looking at definitely a hybrid model for the longer term, but much greater support around home working environments, much greater support around well-being, and also a kind of more engaged kind of middle managers as well around how do they have conversations with their teams around that well-being and support that's needed. I would say we know, for example, from our clients, but also just in our own families, the drain on mental health, but also on women in general has been significant. And I think there's been a lot of stats out there, but actually, you know, women are the most vulnerable, and that's been confirmed by the World Economic Forum. It's also been confirmed by McKinsey in a recent study because of the innate gender inequalities that have been there, and also just that huge burden of care at home. So we're mindful of that. I think workplace flexibility has taken on a whole new definition. I think the working day has changed as well. And certainly old norms around presenteeism and being in the office have shifted. So I'm hopeful about the future. I think that there's a lot to look forward to. I think we're seeing a real paradigm shift coming through around leadership now and how we work and manage teams remotely. It's not easy. I don't think anybody has got it right. I think we're in an experimentation mode. And, you know, if we were having this conversation in 6 months' time, you know, our own organization could look quite different. But I think what we've seen is a real open-mindedness to address new ways of working and make sure we really put people at the heart of every organization. And I think that's been echoed with our client base as well. We have lots of conversations about how are they using the technology, how are they finding it, is it working for them? You know, the digital skills, the shift around that has been significant for everybody. And then I think cybersecurity has taken on a whole new realm with ransomware attacks, and certainly we've seen that with our friends in the HSC recently. So I know it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of it. I could talk all day about this. I think it's a really fascinating topic, and I think I'd love to hear what Fergus and Orla have around the subject as well. But I mean, it's an amazing time to be in technology and also to really embrace a new way of working. I don't think the office has changed this dramatically over the last 50 years. And now we're seeing we can throw it, you know, up in the air and really transform how we look at work and how we engage with our colleagues and peers to drive greater growth and productivity.
Thanks, Margarete. You bring up some really good points there. And I'll open the floor to Fergus, I suppose, to get your input into what Margarete has said.
Yeah, thanks Colette, thanks Margarete, and thanks particularly for the invite and congratulations on this initiative. There's a lot there that resonates with me, obviously, you know. I think what Margarete is saying is we're in this unprecedented shift in the way we work. We probably haven't seen it, certainly not in any of our lifetimes. We probably haven't seen it really for maybe 100 years, this idea of an almost revolution in the way that we work, you know. So yeah, like Margarete says, I think we're very much at the start of it. So we've had this sudden jerk of a shift to remote working, you know. So we went from, the stats that I saw was 4% of people who were remote working up to 60 or 70%, literally overnight or over the space of a week or two. I would say we're still predominantly, even though we're remote working, we're still predominantly locked into a way of working that we had before that. So there's sort of two bits at play, I think, over the next while. It has to be, there's where we work, where we physically work, and then how we work in that model, you know. And again, what Margarete said is organizations are going to take a variety of approaches and probably need to be flexible and adaptable. Laying down a policy now that you think is going to work for the next 2 or 3 years probably isn't realistic. So it has to be agile, it has to be able to move, and it has to be able to respond to a lot of different parameters, you know. And the other thing I think that I've noted in a lot of discussions about this is everybody brings like extraordinary bias to this conversation. We have a familiarity that you know, of a way that we worked in the past, which is, so we have a bias around what we knew. We all have our own biases about what works for us. And then we have this thing going on at the moment where we have this huge bias about what our peers are doing, what other organizations are doing, what our friends who work are doing, and so on. So we have to look past that and really have a hard look at how we want to work, and then where we need to do it, you know. And what I've heard emerging is just this changing role for the office, and the office not being this location where you work, but being the facilitator for how you want to work. So Margarete mentioned it there, presenteeism. That's the current kind of status quo, if you wish, which is you're in the office, you're in from 9 to 5, and we're moving towards the office being more of a focal point for what we would traditionally have considered, I would say, off-site activities. You know, collaboration, creativity, coaching, training, mentoring, things where you would have immediately said, we need to get out of the office for this, I think are the sort of things that you're going to want to be in the office for as we go forward, you know. But it's been a very strange time, and I think we're at the cusp of an enormous opportunity, and there's so many elements of that, and I just feel that you know, it needs that, you know, it's going to need that openness to really figure out what works for us as a society, as an economy, and so on. And that's going to take real leadership. And I think that's going to be the key theme that emerges over the next while is a more modern style of leadership is going to define what the sort of best practices are here.
Yeah. Orla, would you agree with that in terms of leadership? It's one of the challenges that I would see for future working is how we change the leadership to being all-inclusive.
Yeah, very much so. I agree with all the points that have been made. I think it's really interesting how, for all that technology is critical to what we've done over the last 15 months or thereabouts, ultimately it boils down to people. You know, how people interact, how they work, how they are productive, you know, how they split their balance between work and lives. Margaret is absolutely right to point out the gendered implications of what we've all lived through, and also other demographic implications. So, you know, people like myself who are a bit older and have a house and a garden and so on in a suburb, much easier than if you are just starting your career, maybe living in a one-bed apartment somewhere and balancing your laptop on the side of your bed or whatever. And also, and I think it's really interesting, those who and the implications for Ireland of this. Those who have come to work in Ireland from outside the country, and we know that in Engineers Ireland at the moment, about 40% of our new members each year are what we call global engineers, those educated outside Ireland or the UK, a huge part of our economic success in recent years. And, you know, many of those now have gone back to their home countries. Will they, you know, what will happen to that workforce in this new environment? What are the implications for Ireland of that shift? What are the implications for Ireland and for Dublin of the shift? Again, Dublin has been arguably a breaking point in terms of its infrastructure pre-pandemic. You know, rural Ireland can you know, has huge opportunities, I think, under this new dispensation if things are worked well. So I think there are all sorts of societal, economic, cultural implications that are going to be really interesting to tease out. There was a report recently from the British Academy where they talked about the COVID decade. Not saying that the pandemic will last a decade, we hope, but that the implications will be playing out over the course of this decade. And I think that's absolutely true. So this one has a very, very long way to run. We're in the very, very early part of these discussions. I agree with others that what we're looking to is a period of transition now and of learning as we seek to move back to the workplace to some extent. And let's see what we learn as we move back and what we decide we need to take forward.
Yeah. And just to pick up on that period of transition, and as I suppose that all of you have raised, one of the barriers that I would come across or I would see in the industry is organizations not being open to a new way of work, where we've seen some of the larger ones quite surprisingly go, no, we want everybody back in the office. We want that presentee culture. How do you think we can change that, or what are the barriers to changing it that organizations might address? Margaret, I might start with you.
Yeah, I think, you know, I love the theme of this conversation, because I think it's such a learning process we're going through right now, and no one's got the right answer. Like, we haven't got this figured out by any means. We're certainly at this kind of period of transition. I think you're right. And Colette, I think there's some organizations that have kind of gone back to traditional ways and are saying, you know what, we just want everybody back in for whatever reason, and we're going to keep going. And I think, you know, they may be right. They may have their own reasons for that. Some are essential workers that have to go back in. But I think there's a real opportunity to reshape things. And we've got a large younger demographic coming through, like with graduates and apprentices. And certainly their values that we've surveyed them a lot. We've asked them a lot of questions. And actually, we've had mixed views. Like, so Fergus touched on the need to go back in, to collaborate, to connect, to mentor, to the whole social interaction that we've missed. You know, I think we all hugely appreciate our colleagues now and see them much more as friends than we actually realized before the pandemic. So I think the younger generation, actually, for staff retention and employee retention, will choose whether they will work with some employers and some not, depending on the level of flexibility, creativity, how they live their values and their purpose. You know, so I think we could see quite a bit of a movement in the labour market, depending on where things settle in a few months' time, and hopefully we'll move through this pandemic, and things will stabilise and open up more and more. But I think it's going to be fairly obvious, to be honest, Colette, actually, with the labour force dynamics, as to what staff will choose to work with different employers, depending on the purpose and the values and the role of the office, you know, and the purpose that it's there for. So I think that will come through.
Orla, in, I suppose, the student body and UCD, would you see kind of a change towards that in terms of being more focused on the work-life balance and work culture and flexibility? Is that something graduates are looking for and organizations need to be open to for their graduate programs?
I think it certainly is. In terms of our own educational offerings to students, what we have found is that students and staff alike are desperate to get back onto campus. You know, as a university, we are a campus-based organisation, we are a community, and while people did wonderful things with such agility and such purpose in pivoting online, you know, we want to be together, we want to be in a room, you know, discussing once again, and we hope that that can happen before too long in our research labs and also in our teaching. Our research labs are already continuing very well, but we want to get things back up to 100% activity as soon as we possibly can. So we want to get the students back, but it will be different in many ways. You know, we're talking about pivoting the learning experience, whereas traditionally you would have had, okay, if you think of the very, very traditional experience where a big lecture within a big room is delivering material out to students, and then they go off and they do their homework and so on outside class. You know, in many cases you might want to see, should that be pivoted? Do you give the students the material through video or whatever mechanism outside the lecture theatre, and then they come into campus, and that's where they discuss and they collaborate and they do all sorts of wonderful team projects? So kind of like what others have been saying, you know, do we think again about what our physical facilities are for and where people do the best elements of their work? But I think it's really interesting. I think we're seeing similar dynamics in education to what we're seeing in the workplace more generally.
Yeah. And Fergus, I suppose that ties into kind of the idea that you had put forward, that we're actually kind of changing our thinking about what the workspace or the office space functions at. That it's now more about the social elements that Orla and Margarete have mentioned. How do you see us, I suppose, adopting that or trying to bring that into working culture, because it's such a sea change from what we had before?
Yeah, I suppose I just to go back to the previous point, which is about kind of young people coming into the workforce and so on. I do think I'm technically a millennial, believe it or not, but I think I'm a geriatric millennial is what somebody said. It's a terminology, but I am technically a millennial, and like, just on this, they're fundamentally our society. You know, we've kind of let young people down as a society, and there's issues around, you know, employment and housing is a major one. And you know, for young people, this should be a bit of a revolutionary moment, which is, you know, this can define them having the ability to own a home, the ability to have proper work-life balance in Ireland, close to their families, this opportunity that we're talking about today. So for young people, you know, I think they really want to latch onto this and see this as a major opportunity, and kind of fight for it. That's just a when I was listening to Orla there and about students coming through, and they will. The fight for talent is real. You know, that's like we see it. We're in a recruitment drive at the moment, and we see it, and the challenge in getting people, and the fact that people are now in a different mindset. People are now saying, well, no, I live in Kerry, so take it or leave it, you know. So this is kind of starting to creep in, and I think it will more and more. People will vote with their feet. You know, in terms of this hybrid working arrangement, you know, yeah, it's a funny one. I think you know, what have we demonstrated in the last 18 months? You know, we know that remote working works, but we know that there's these big gaps and issues emerging, but people are comfortable doing it. So we've actually, whatever about COVID and the devastation it's caused, one thing it's done is it's created this mass work experiment that never ever would have happened, or it might have taken another 50 years to happen. So there can be no doubt that this kind of works now, you know. And I think the other thing it's brought to the fore, much more so, is it's made organizations, I believe there's been this emergence of empathy effectively. I think it's made organizations kind of think about their staff as parents and carers and partners and pet owners. And Margarete said it there, which is like, I think we've had a deeper, even though we're all remote, I think we've had this deeper connection with the people we work with, because you know, there is this blurring of the line between our work and personal lives. And like, so I think that I hope that feeling permeates through the decisions that are made, because you know what happened was there was a national crisis, and then really leadership in many organizations made decisions very quickly in order to protect the well-being of the people that worked for them and their families and the people that they cared for, and so on. And I think that sort of demonstrated an empathy that probably a lot of people wouldn't have thought existed in their workplace in some ways. So so how is it all going to work? Well, I think if we can carry that through, that people's personal time, that people's personal commitments are core to who they are, and if we can understand that, you know, if we can look at the tasks that we need to do as an organization and start to understand, well, you know, yes, we've definitely lost out on the ability to recruit and bring people on board, the ability to train and mentor people, the ability to, you know, it's even, you know, there's even issues around progression, about the visibility of people. If they're 3 or 4 levels down the organizational structure, they're not getting their moment in the sun with the decision makers in the organization. So we have to really think about those bits that we've lost and what our core objectives are of an organization. And if you overlay them, you can start to understand the office is a functional space. It's just full of desks at the moment, which is, you know, in a way a hangover of presenteeism and in a way we thought about the workspace. But it's still a very functional space that, and you have to look at, well, what are the things we're going to need to do now that we don't do, we need to do more of, what the meetings look like. Because meetings to me, like we're still doing meetings the way we did meetings, and they don't work, because dominant voices like myself take a lot of space, and then people who have huge value but are maybe at the quieter end of that spectrum aren't getting their input and their influence on decisions and so on. So like that, there's so much lost in the virtual world. So, but I think you just have to, yeah, you know, it's easy to jump to a solution, and I think everybody, you know, immediately everybody started going, well, it's going to be 2 or 3 days a week in the office. But challenge that, like, what does that mean? Why is that just better, or is, you know, is that just, well, it's a halfway house? Like, what are we trying to do? Who are the people who need to be there to do it? And what are all those bits that are really important to be together for? And they are really important. The one thing from COVID that I took away is humans, surprise, surprise, really want to be around other humans. And it's really important for our mental well-being. So we have to stitch that into work somehow. But at the same time, you know, we have to do it through an empathetic lens of what people's lives are and what, you know, where they've gone, particularly in the past 18 months. So that's a very roundabout way of answering not your question, a little bit of your question and some previous questions.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And there's 2 points I suppose I'd like to pick up on that. You talked about the blurring of lines between the personal and the professional, and how that has kind of made us more empathetic to each other. One of the stats that I heard recently was that in the work from home environment, when there's 2 parents, male and female, the kids are 30% more likely to interrupt the mum than they would the dad. So one of the things that I can't comprehend is how you stop that, because that's not something organizations can control, but it means that women are in a more disadvantaged position trying to make the balance between work and home life. I wonder if Margarete or Orla would like to come in on how we could maybe address that, or how it could be managed by organizations to try and help.
There's a lot of attitudinal bias out there, Colette, that you've touched on, right? And it's kind of deep-seated for all of us, actually. And it's something that we're all kind of now realizing that actually this has had a major regressive effect on females in particular. And so I think it's something that we're trying to pay close attention to. I don't know if there's a silver bullet here that can fix this. I think, you know, greater focus on childcare, rebalancing of roles and responsibilities at home, and the care factor with workplaces, understanding family commitments. And I definitely think, as Fergus said, the blurring of lines, it's kind of made us all a bit more human, right? We all kind of appreciate who's got dogs, who's got young kids, who's got elderly parents around. So I think we're a lot more empathetic. But I think it's going to take a while to shift this bias that's out there. And I think that's a really interesting point, Colette, that you've made about, you know, children interrupting their moms rather than their dads. I think I'm not surprised to hear that. I think absolutely we've got to work on correcting that bias, and rebalancing. Role modeling as well will be really important. So I think all we can do is try and, you know, be aware of it, put the right kind of foundation in place to say, let's address it moving forward, and ensure that large and small employers are a lot more flexible around home care situations for everybody.
And if I might just add to that, Colette, and I agree with everything that Margarete has said there. Pre-pandemic, we in higher education were very much looking at gender equality to improve our position in gender equality, and we all have action plans, which are very specific things, like, for example, not running core meetings very early or very late in the day when people with childcare responsibilities are involved in school drop-offs or school pickups or whatever. So, you know, we need to look at those again and see, do we need more or different or new specific rules and regulations about how we do things. There are opportunities, though. I mean, we're talking a lot about empathy and the need to understand people better in this new environment, understand how people operate. So there are opportunities for new leadership styles to emerge, and for people to be, you know, trained and accelerated through the workforce based on those empathetic skills. So I think that there are certainly opportunities for new types of leaders to emerge, but it will require leadership to take this as a priority and to look at it quite strategically and quite scientifically to see, okay, so what are the barriers here? And one by one, how do we pick them off?
Yeah, and I think from my point of view, it's very important to identify those barriers, and not just, as Fergus had mentioned earlier, our biases that we kind of currently exist and carry with us. I think the future work we need to be open to each other and to all the challenges that have arisen in the last 18 months.
I think as well, Colette, like we need to normalize fathers as carers and parents as well, you know, that like I make a point, you know, of saying, and it's one thing I've noticed actually since COVID is that you would be on a call at 10 to 5 and, you know, people would say, I have to go and get the kids now in 15 minutes. And I think if you were in an office environment, that wouldn't have washed. But I think because both parents are at home, or I'd like to think, maybe I'm overly optimistic, that the caring responsibilities are evening out. I'd like to think that it certainly is a fact in our house, but we just have to be careful with language around this and normalize, you know, like this idea of, you know, I often have a conversation with my wife where she'd say, oh, are you babysitting the kids at the weekend? And I'd say, I'm not babysitting them, they're my kids. I'm not babysitting them, they're my kids, you know, so don't say babysit or this daddy daycare nonsense. You know, there's language that we use in our society which creates that implied unevenness of care between parents, and we need to normalize that both parents have caring responsibilities and they should be treated in the same way. Obviously, I'm coming at it from a man's perspective, where but both parents should be treated in the same way and given the same leeway. This idea that like that's crazy that the kids are interrupting the mother more. I mean, no, I don't think it happens in this house. I'm not sure. I haven't started monitoring it too much, but it's a crazy stat,
Maybe it is something to monitor. I was quite shocked when I heard it, given the fact, we think both parents are home, that it would be even. But because I have to say thanks to bringing up the topic from the male perspective and just normalizing it, as you say, because there is still, and I think guys are trying to change it so that they aren't babysitting, and they're, they are looking after their own kids, not babysitting it. But I think it's maybe one of the barriers that we're not brilliant at yet.
No, definitely not. But it's been broken down over time. You see like definitely, I know a friend of mine who was the stay-at-home dad, and he spoke about going to the school gate and it was all mothers, and how kind of isolated he felt in that situation, and like they weren't inviting him for coffee. But that's completely changed. Like I bring my kids down pretty much every second day, pretty much, down to the school gate, and it's definitely, and this is the benefit of what we're going through at the moment, is there's this change. You see a lot more parents on their own, fathers on their own, mothers on their own with kids, and that's the normalization that needs to happen, because otherwise there will be this implicit idea that the mother is the primary carer, which obviously makes sense at a certain stage in a child's life, but like once they're out of that stage, it makes absolutely zero sense. It has to be a shared effort.
Yeah, and I think if organizations, as we're coming through this, are conscious of that, so that there's equal sharing. I think I saw an article yesterday that a company in Galway called Rent the Runway, I hope that's correct, have given 20 weeks parental leave to all their staff, so regardless of gender, which again is trying to work towards breaking down, that primary care role and equally distributing it between the two parents.
Yeah.
I think
I'd often caution about those things, though, that you can have a policy in an organization and then you can have a culture in an organization. That's so true. What's actually happening on the ground, and do people feel that they will be supported in those choices that they're making for their family, or are they actually disadvantaged by doing so, or even perceived disadvantage for doing so? So very important that, actually it's almost the opposite in my organization. Sometimes I think the policies don't feel very flexible. Public sector body, it's quite, but actually as an organization, we're extremely caring and extremely, if anybody has any challenges in their lives, it's amazing to see the organization wrap themselves around them, So like there is this, so we have a culture which is very caring, but maybe the policies don't strike you as such. So do be careful about those headlines sometimes.
Yeah, that's true. We might just pause there. I hate to interrupt the conversation, but I might just pause there and ask Sarah to maybe ask some of the audience questions. Sarah, are you there?
Yeah, thanks, Colette. Okay, we've got a fair few questions coming in. I've got one here from Magella Henshin. She says, in ESB, our chief executive describes this transition as our leaders needing to walk on the bridge from here to the future while we are building it without knowing exactly where the bridge is going. Do you think there is a way that we in engineering can help us all cross this bridge together and be comfortable with the ambiguity?
Orla, do you want to? Or Margarete, jump in?
Yeah, I'm happy just to start with that. I think well done to ESB, as always, kind of flying the flag and being a progressive organisation. I think all leaders, right? So I don't think it's just for engineering or utilities. I think I could say honestly for the banking sector, for the telco sector, for the technology sector, we're all trying to figure this out, right? So I think there's a little bit about having an experimentation mindset here, being open to being fluid around this, trialing things. And I know we're doing a lot of surveys and checking in with staff, but I think we're going to have to keep open around how we're going to navigate this over the next year, right? Because it's not going to be, nobody has this fully worked out. I think all of us are kind of saying, let's go trial and error and see how this works from a hybrid perspective. And we've kind of got together in terms of employee forums. There's different kind of ERG groups, employee resource groups that are feeding back constantly around how people are experiencing it, who's affected most, who's not affected, how are managers finding it, remotely managing teams. And so actually, the more we can do of listening to our employees and our client base and our partners, the better, right? And just being open-minded to pivot things and not being afraid to try new things. I mean, one of the things that we've introduced inside our organization, kind of walk and talk meetings, just to get people outside and get a bit of fresh air, because we found it was just so hard being on Zoom calls all day long. And then days to turn your camera off. So on Fridays, our US colleagues don't have their cameras on. Other simple things like when people are going on holidays, you really are on holidays. So you do not have access to your emails. Now, I know we can't all do that. And some people have critical roles with essential services. But these are small initiatives that we're all trialing around our organization to see how's this going to work and how do we provide greater creativity, but greater balance, what's working, what's not working. So I think open-mindedness is the key there. There's no right or wrong answer in this one. And we're all going to keep going and try and find the right answer over time when things settle.
That's great. Thanks, Margarete. Okay, next one is from John Coleman. On the topic of women in engineering, what can we, the engineering community, do to encourage parents to promote engineering to their daughters and also to accept that their daughters may be interested in engineering? That is one of the biggest hurdles to be overcome, in my opinion.
Yeah, and maybe if I lead off on that, Colette, and this is one that it continues to be a challenge, and you know, gosh, when I was, you know, finishing secondary school back in the 1980s, you know, we had this challenge, and we still have it today, and it's extraordinary to me in some ways that it is still, you know, a battle that we need to fight for each generation, but that is the nature. And I suppose it's a problem with our profession in that the fruits of our activity are literally everywhere. You know, our phones, our cars, our electricity, everywhere you see the work of engineering, but you don't see engineers. So it is still difficult to get the word out to people as to what engineers do, the extraordinary opportunities in the sector, and you know, the rewarding careers that people can build, delivering great things for the world in areas like sustainability, like biomedical engineering, about which people are so passionate. So it's really a question of communication, of role models, of messaging, of getting the word out again and again and again. And even when you're sick of saying these things, you say it again and again, because every year there's a new generation of school leavers who need to hear that message. And one would hope that over time, and I think we are seeing over time, certainly in UCD, we've seen the number of women in our engineering programs tick up over time, so that it's now, I don't know, is it 30-something% or thereabout. So, you know, we're getting there. It's slow, and, you know, it is sometimes frustrating that it's not as fast as we would like it to be, but we're certainly getting there, and let's keep going.
Thanks, Orla. Okay, Fergus, I'll give you this one. Georgina Malloy has come in to say, thanks for talking about visibility, Fergus. Generally, women are maybe not as good as men at being visible. I wonder, is remote working making women even less visible? And how can women make themselves more visible and make their work be seen?
Yeah, that's kind of the point I was getting at, is that, you know, look, you know, I don't think I can speak too cogently about the challenges that face women. If I want to know about them in engineering, I'll ask women about them. So, but one would seem to be that, you know, getting that recognition and opportunity, and, you know, the ability to contribute can be a problem in a very male-dominated environment, you know. And I suppose if that's been exacerbated by this online you know, format of our meetings and so on, then it's problematic. And I think that's where, you know, what I was saying about, you know, the fact that we're doing the same things we did in offices, but we're doing them remotely, is the pattern we've naturally fallen into. So the only thing predominantly that's changed is where we work, and how we work hasn't really changed. And again, that's maybe an important theme that comes out of this discussion today, is that if the fact that we've taken the same working style and translated it to the online environment, if that's exacerbating these issues and barriers for women, well, then the solution to that is to come up with new ways of working in this remote hybrid arrangement, to ensure that they do get the ability to profile themselves, they do get the ability to have their influence on decisions, and they don't, in certain organizations, they don't feel that they're sinking further into the background, because that's quite alarming, and that's something that I would be concerned about. Is this, effectively, people who are lower down the food chain getting their ability and getting their opportunities is going to become harder because they're less visible. That's frightening, so that just speaks to, we cannot just go to do what we did in the office remotely. And it also speaks to the importance of the hybrid arrangement. What are the things that we're going to actually do together, and making sure that in those activities that we do together, that there is equal opportunity, and that there is opportunity for people to profile themselves and get recognition. So it just speaks to, like, I find that bit quite alarming, that something that was a problem in the physical workplace is now becoming a bigger problem for women in the remote workplace. That's extremely alarming, and something that needs to be addressed.
Thanks, Fergus. Okay, another one here from Charles Smith. With the remote working and the increasing problems of cybersecurity, I've heard a lot of feedback of people having problems with remote support for their home equipment. This causes additional stress, being unable to attend remote meetings, and additional working hours waiting for problems to be resolved. Any thoughts from the panel?
Work for tech companies. I'm happy to start off on this one. I think he's hit the nail on the head, Charles. I think we're all, there's nobody that's got away with this in terms of digital skills, digital access. If your technology lets you down and you're working remotely, you're kind of stuffed. And so I've spent endless time myself on the phone to our help desk trying to get my laptop up and working recently. I feel the frustration for others as well. I think, many of us work in organizations where we have help desks and they're up and running, and they, everybody appreciates that we need to drive productivity remotely. So I think many of us can navigate through that and get these challenges, whether it's log on challenges or whether it's updates around cybersecurity, whatever it might be, sorted. I think what it doesn't address really is we have a huge issue with digital poverty. So actually those that don't have access to the devices, don't have access to fast Wi-Fi, or don't have the skills. And I think this pandemic has highlighted for many countries around the world that actually there's a lot of people that are struggling, that don't have access to these kind of core essentials. And we all have a responsibility to make sure that we divide that up, that we have greater equality, and that we ensure that people have the skills to connect into these services in a remote way, and have the Wi-Fi connection and the broadband to do that as well. So that's an initiative we're working on. Digital poverty is something very close to Michael Dell's heart. I know for many of the big tech companies and the telcos, they're all focused on increasing the broadband as well. But I hear your pain around the simple day-to-day issues of your technology letting you down, or your laptop not working, or your Wi-Fi cutting out at a critical meeting. There's nothing more frustrating, and actually kind of wonder, would you be better going back into the office? Hopefully they won't happen as often as they have in the past, and certainly Wi-Fi and the technology is getting better. I think many of you will have seen Microsoft are doing some new releases around Teams, and there's new platforms coming out like Viva that will be more intuitive, and so I think the online platforms that we've got are just going to keep getting better. Software is going to keep increasing. Unfortunately, cybersecurity attacks may keep increasing as well, and the sophistication of those attacks is increasing. So it brings it back down to the awareness and the skills is so important in getting that right, and making sure that everybody's got the basic cyber skills and the basic digital skills to connect in with these services.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, I've got another one here from Gabrielle McGee. Do women need mentoring more than men, as men naturally have more social contacts and get mentoring on an informal basis?
Possibly, yes, yeah. Different people interact in different ways. I think all employees need mentoring as they seek to advance in the workplace. There might be some who for whatever natural reason, don't need it as much as others. But I think that companies should be looking at putting in place mentoring for all of their employees, and particularly at this time, given that, you know, whatever informal networks there might have been around the water cooler or whatever, you know, they are diminished now. So I think mentoring is more important than ever. I think it is a different form of mentoring in some cases that will be needed, but I think it's something that certainly should be a focus of companies.
Yeah,
I'd just like to jump in. Sorry, Colette, you go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Margarete.
I was just going to echo what Orla said. I actually feel like mentoring really has kind of come into its own paradigm in the last 18 months, Orla, as you said, like, and actually there's a bit of a shift in it as well, how we do it. So virtual mentoring, reverse mentoring. We've introduced a reverse mentoring program there a couple of years ago for our kind of digital natives, because we've got quite a mature workforce as well. And we wanted to bridge those digital skills. And that has paid off, because now most of what we've got a good core baseline of digital skills across the organization. But I think reverse mentoring or any kind of mentoring program really needs to be catapulted actually with this paradigm shift now, and make sure that we're engaging all of our workforce, those that are remote and those that are going back in, and pairing up people. I guess the other element of this that we haven't really touched on is diversity. And Fergus touched on it. You can live anywhere now and work anywhere, really. But it does open up the opportunity to have new diverse talent pools and to have a much broader diverse workforce. And so I think we really want to harness that kind of creativity and that inclusiveness and really bring it to its fore. And mentoring programs are a great way to do that.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it's fundamental to the future of work is to bring mentoring along with the change and the leadership changes that we're going. I know for myself, I've been a mentor and a mentee and gained so much on both sides. So I think it's vitally important to keep it going into the future to help. So Sarah, we might leave I know there's probably a lot more questions on the audience side, but I'm just conscious of the time. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll get to them, but what we might do is try and address some of them or some of the themes on the LinkedIn page over the next couple of weeks. So I have one last question for the panel, and that's in relation to the theme for International Women in Engineering Day. And the theme this year is Engineering Heroes. So for each of you, I suppose I'd like to know who your engineering hero is. Orla, I might start with you, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah, and I'm going to mention a few names. I put a photo on Twitter this morning that I love myself, and Jane Grimson, who is the first woman president of Engineers Ireland, and Linda Doyle, also an engineer who's shortly going to take up the role of the first ever provost of Trinity College, and it's more than 400 years of history. So you know, both women I know, they're friends. They've been wonderful supports to me personally throughout my career, and they're just inspirational. And they are inspirational because of what they've achieved, but also I think the manner in which they have led and I think will lead. I think Linda will be a very different type of academic leader, and I think that this is brilliant. So they are absolutely engineering heroes of mine. Another I want to mention, because I think it's so important to call out the role of men as well in supporting women, and in UCD, if there are UCD engineers on the line here, a huge friend and mentor to me was Professor Tom Brazel of UCD, who was so supportive, so helpful. Tom terribly sadly passed away just a couple of months into what was going to be a very active retirement, and he's very, very greatly missed. So in conversations like this, I always remember Tom, what a wonderful and inspirational mentor he was to me, and so many more. So they're mine. They're just some of mine.
Excellent. Fergus?
Yeah, it's funny, I'd never really thought about this before, which is an odd one. As it's Women in Engineering Day, it would be remiss of me to mention two incredible women engineers and leaders that had the unfortunate luck to be my managers in the past, but were very important in my career, and I'm lucky to have them as mentors and still to have them in my life as good friends. So that's Dr. Ciara Slevin, who runs a company called Climate Matters now, who was my manager in ESB for several years, and Majella Kelleher, who hired me into SEAI and who retired, and then I'm in the position that she held when I came into SEAI. So there are two women that really sort of, were formative in my career. You know, as a hero, I'm a bit of a space geek, I suppose. Is that a thing? So I'd probably choose Dr. Nora Patton as an engineering hero. So she's an aeronautical engineer from UL, but she's a very strong advocate for not only STEM education, but also for climate action. So I suppose that's who I'd pick today, certainly.
Very good. Sarah?
My engineering hero would be my cousin, Caroline Horn. She's always been a great role model to me, both personally and professionally. And I remember years ago, I used to go down to her for work experience when I first started in college. And I remember clients and colleagues used to ask her kind of like engineering questions, and she used to be able to rhyme off the answer and also quote like from the codes and standards without having to look them up. And I remember thinking, wow, that's impressive, and I want to be just like her. And then in recent years, then working in Australia, she was over there as well, and just she continued being that role model to me, becoming like a working mother and juggling that work-life balance and just always doing it, making it look as easy as possible in everything that she does. So yeah, she's my engineering hero.
Very good. And Margarete?
The one for me, being in technology, is Ada Lovelace. Has always been a bit of a pillar for any females that work in tech companies, because she was one of the first computer programmers, and she's just been such a strong advocate for STEM. But I think I've got plenty actually in terms of current mentors that I'd hold up in high esteem. But Ada Lovelace has always been. I remember studying her in school when I was in primary school as well, and just going, what a phenomenal woman. So I have her as my guiding star.
It's amazing to hear so many kind of women and female engineers. For myself, I suppose there's two people in particular who would have been very strong kind of role models for me as I was coming up. One would have been Anne-Marie Conybeare from JB Barry's. Very much kind of, if you can't see it, you can't be it. Anne-Marie would have worked alongside me for about 13 years, and I would have picked up a lot of traits and a lot of habits and have a lot of respect for her. And the other one is from the male colleague as well, someone who's inspired me with their passion for engineering, and that would be John Penteny from John Civil Engineering. So John adopted me kind of as a mentee when I was a very green graduate, and I've had the pleasure to work with him always on opposite sides of the fence as a contractor with me in the consultancy role. But his passion and continued passion throughout his career and to solve engineering problems and to just teach, just be willing to teach those around him, has always been an inspiration. So those, I know I wouldn't be here today in the role I have without those two role models. So I suppose that brings our event to a close. It just leaves me with a big thank you to our panel for attending today. I think we could probably talk for the afternoon. I know I certainly could on the topics, because it's very topical and close to what we're going through at the moment. But thank you so much for sharing your opinions and your insights from the different areas and the different, I suppose, sector roles that you're working in. It's been very interesting, and thank you to all our attendees today for listening and joining in. We're delighted to have you and to share our information. So I'll just wish you a happy Women in Engineering Day and enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you for joining us.